Hi, Ollie. Hello.
Hi, Marcos.
Hello. Right.
Yeah.
Hello, everyone. Any viewers that we have or listeners at the moment? It's the first episode of the Planetarium podcast, and we'll be talking about plants and astrology, not necessarily in that order. So we don't really have a sort of have a set itinerary today, but I know I thought we'd. What have you had got anything on your mind at the moment, Ollie, or anything that's caught your attention?
Well, I am. I thought talking about decumbiture would be an interesting thing. It's something that certainly I know you're very interested. I'm interested in. I would very much like to discuss it with you, and I think our listeners probably be interested, because it seems to be one of the things people have most questions about in astrological herbalism.
Okay. So decumbiture, just for anyone listening who is like, what the heck are they talking about? Is a branch of medical astrology which has its origins in ancient times. I think the Greeks, there's a Greek text talking about basically decumbiture, and what it is, it's just using astrology in an illness and creating an astrological chart for the time a person first gets sick. And in modern terms, that could be literally the time the person first gets sick. But I always say that you rarely got that time. People don't sort of often. First of all, people often don't fall sick at a particular time. It's an incremental thing, and secondly, they rather inconveniently don't often note the time when they collapse. So
Absolutely.
we do sometimes have a precise decumbiture, like maybe the time of an accident or something, or the time when there's a dramatic sort of beginning of an illness or something, but often we don't. So we use proxies like hospital admission times or the times of tests and stuff, and this is traditionally that was done in medieval Renaissance times. Before that, in classical times, the equivalent in those times was when the patient brought their urine to the physician, because the physician would examine the patient's urine, so they would create a chart for that moment. So those would all be decumbiture charts, and I think the word comes from this Latin, same sort of root as recumbent, to lie
Yes.
down. So, like, the person, which I know but listeners may not. So hence, yeah.
No, no, absolutely. One of the things always puzzled me about, well, this is one of the things that puzzled me about astrology, of course, that this is a deeply puzzling subject. Um, for instance, decumbiture is obviously related to horary astrology, which is, you make a chart for the time you ask a question. And in this day and age, with emails and letters, well, I suppose not so much, but the horary astrologers I talk to will use the time as a question when they actually read the question rather than when it's actually asked. And also the location, because obviously astrology is location based, will be where the location of the astrologer reading the question is. That's how I understand it anyway.
Yeah, that's again. I know that some. This is sort of all very, the discrepancies between different astrologers on this one. And we will, for any herbal folks, we will talk about herbs in this podcast as well. We're not going to be fully, but just because this is a niche that we both share, and these are questions that often come up. So we'll address the astrological ones first, I think. So the yeah, it's a really interesting one, because there are different opinions on that. But the standard traditional thing, as you say, is when the astrologer or medical person who was doing astrology received the question, if they're doing what was known as horary astrology, which is answering questions with astrology. So in medical terms, this would be, for example, the traditionally preferred chart would be the decumbiture chart. But let's say for whatever reason you don't have a decumbiture chart. Maybe you were asking about a sick relative, or maybe this patient who you've just gone to visit is in a coma or sick, and can't, you're a traditional physician in the Renaissance era, and you can't get a sample of the patient's urine because they're basically in a coma, and none of the family knows when the disease began. So you could do a horary chart. You could ask a question, or a family member might come to you and ask about my sick partner, or whatever. So that's just the context thing. So it would be the next sort of rung down, if you in terms of triage. Like you'd prefer to get a decumbiture if you could. If you couldn't, then a horary will do. And to your point, Ollie, about this sort of discussion about when is the appropriate time to create that chart, it would traditionally be when the astrologer receives the question. So in modern terms, that would be not when, say, a client thinks of a question or when they send an email asking about the question, but when the astrologer receives it. And the best analogy I've read for this, an explanation, is probably from one of John Frawley's books, where he talks about like the astrologer being a midwife for the question. So the question being like, so when the question is conceived of is like the conception of the child, and when it is first delivered to the astrologer and the astrologer has sight of it is like the birth of the question, because without the astrologer being there to interpret it, the thing will never live. It has to be birthed into the world. So that is the moment that the question actually takes form in a way that can be interpreted.
Which does make sense to me. I mean, as a herbalist as well who uses astrology, I mean, because most of, I mean, and I'm sure this is your experience too, Marcus, most of my herbal things are often, I've been feeling crap for ages now, sort of thing, in that sort of, and so it's like, well, when did it start? Well, it was maybe
yeah, totally.
Well, it's like, oh God, okay. And so you're basically relying on that. But then within that, there's always, when I actually ask, I always try to say something like, so what have you come here for? But then you might get a whole load of spiel for 15 minutes about not about what they came here for. So
Oh
there's
yeah, well that's the
fine tuning
classic.
in this as
Yeah,
well.
I mean that's classic, isn't it? So, and that, as you well know, that the patients who come in and say they've come for one thing, but then when you get into it, it turns out there may be a whole set of shelves underneath that initial thing. I always remember there was a patient saw years ago when I was teaching at Middlesex, who came in and said he was there to help give up coffee, and then it turned out in the course of the next hour and a half that there was actually a lot of other stuff going on. There was like hemochromatosis and just like, there was a bunch of stuff. There was whole shelves of stuff. So, and that's not to cast aspersions on the patient, because often several things could be going on there. The first thing is people often come with a particular intention at the top of their mind, and that is the thing that matters to them at that moment, and fair enough. And then the other thing is very often it's sometimes a courage thing. People are afraid to open up the Pandora's box of the issues that are underneath that they're really worried about. So it's easier to broach this, a milder, less, more harmless issue. And then, you have those door handle moments, which I think are common to literally every therapist, a conventional physician, acupuncturist, psychotherapist, whatever, where the patient is literally leaving the room, has one handle on the doorknob, and then tells you, then drops the bomb, like, oh, by the way, I've got one kidney. Oh, but, and this is after you've done an hour and a half.
I have a friend that had a classic example of that. So, an hour session, the person had gone through all their, substantial illnesses.
Yeah.
And then on the way, I said, oh, I'm really good we're leaving now because I have to pee every hour.
Right. Yeah, exactly. I mean, I've literally had, by the way, I've got one kidney. That I'm not, I didn't make that up just for effect. That was literally a door handle moment. This is a patient who I'd been through the whole medical history and everything, and they just dropped it on the way out. I was like, okay, could you sit back down for a moment, please? Because I think I might need to ask you a couple more questions.
So going back, Marcos, then,
yeah.
When would you time that for? From the kidney moment, or from
this gets onto a slight in terms of the medical astrology type thing, and this opens up a whole thing that maybe we could talk about in another episode, or maybe later on in this one, which is about why and when one would use medical astrology and the ethics of using it and all of that, because there's a whole set of uh, interesting tangents and potential cans of worms that can branch off of that one. But yeah, the one thing would be a consultation chart. So decumbiture is when the person gets sick. A horary is if you ask a question
Yes.
about a person because for whatever reason or another you can't get the decumbiture. There is an intermediate chart, and that's the consultation chart, and that's the chart that I use most of the time, which is the time that you first have a consultation with a particular patient.
Oh, right. So
So the
the only
beginning, it's usually the beginning, the actual beginning of the consultation, not the diary beginning, because you know I know some medical astrology types who say, "Can I? Oh, that's good. I could do the chart before I see the patient." I'm like, "No, no, no, no,
oh,
no,
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 no.
no, no, no. Have you heard of the, like rescheduling, patients being late, you know, things not going?" So you kind of have to wait until the actual consultation because it's funny how things arrange themselves. You know, if
Yes.
you look at the sky for a particular day and you think you have a client at 10 o'clock and you think, oh, that's good, it's the hour of Jupiter and this is going that way, and the client turns up half an hour late and you've got a completely different chart. So you know, well, you just don't know. So yeah, the consultation chart is the one. So, and that I think you would, that chart you would create from the moment that consultation
So
begins.
do you think this is actually, as you know, people who are looking into introducing a bit of astrology, particularly from the decumbiture point of view, and I'm
Yeah.
using that as an umbrella term, that's the type of chart they're most likely to going to use, a consultation
100,
chart?
yes, yes, because practically speaking you always have it, you can always look at them for your own R&D, um, and you don't need any of the the client's private information or consent to look at that because you're not using their birth chart information.
Yes.
You're just looking at the astrology of that situation and of the time, and it's got a built-in a useful failsafe in that the chart itself should describe some of the circumstances that you discussed and issues that you discussed during the consultation, which is, you know, sort
Right.
of quite handy. Um,
And that's
so
when
yeah.
Culpeper said things like make sure the chart is radical and things like that, isn't it? Or
You,
yes,
I don't know. Does he talk about that,
or is
or is
that
that
Lilly? I can never remember it.
Lilly? You're thinking about
It's
William Lilly.
Lilly. He's much more, yes.
We're throwing out names of Renaissance astrologers, which we're both rather enamored of, listener or watcher, because yeah,
Well, let's just give a brief. I mean, Culpeper, I'm sure most people know, but he was a 17th century herbalist who was instrumental in, first thing he did was translate the sort of doctor's medicine guide from Latin into English, which was very, very unpopular with the doctors because until then you had to be learning and know Latin before you could actually dispense anything.
yeah,
And then he wrote Culpeper's Herbal, which has never been out of print, which is basically a lot of herbs in a sort of alphabetical order with their uses, and also interestingly with their planetary correspondences and how to use them should you be so inclined. But it's a very interesting book because you can use it just as I'll look up headache in the index and put a suitable herb, all the way down to very, really very complicated astrological stuff.
yes. And just a word of warning in terms of using it. Obviously, we're talking about if you are a qualified herbalist or you have some knowledge of herbal medicine. I wouldn't suggest to. I mean, not to say that if you don't have training, you can't get some good stuff out of Culpeper's Herbal. You can, but just bear in mind that it was written in the 17th century, so it is useful to have some. Like both Ollie, you have a master's in herbal medicine. I have a BSc in herbal medicine. Been practicing for many years. Yada yada. So the point is, you need some knowledge to use the herbs. So, for example, he talks about foxglove being an excellent gentle
Yes.
purge, whereas, of course, foxglove we now know is the source of the drug digitalis, which is very cardioactive poison if given in the wrong dosage. And most of the time, it would act as a purge, meaning making you vomit or go to the toilet quite quickly. But if you don't purge, then it could kill you. So
Yes.
I wouldn't describe it as a gentle anything really. So yeah,
Yeah.
I
So
think
to be used with caution, and
yeah,
yeah, definitely if
lots
you
lots of useful stuff and amazing knowledge in there, and lots of forgotten knowledge, but also to be used as you say, with
caution.
a bit of
Get
caution.
yourself a decent herbal if you're not a herbalist, you know, for the public, and the double cross-check stuff in there. It'll
Yes,
definitely
yeah,
tell you.
exactly. So
If
maybe
it's
get
not in that,
Bartram's, yes, like Bartram's Herbal or something,
yes,
Bartram's
exactly.
Encyclopedia of Herbal Medicine, and that, because that's quite a. I mean, again, like no book is perfect. It has its own issues, but it's a good little basic reference book for plants, and gives you a bit of background on them, and so
And we'll
on.
definitely tell you if they're poisonous as well. So it's a
Yes,
big
yeah.
bonus. Marcos, why don't you tell us about our other hero, William Lilly? As I've done
All
Culpeper.
right. I wanted to add a little addendum
All
about
right.
Culpeper first, if you would, because maybe we'll double team it on Lilly then afterwards.
Okay.
But because Culpeper, he was, I mean, you say he wrote the English Physician, which came to be known as his herbal. But actually, as you know, he sort of didn't. He did write some of it.
Yeah.
But it's largely plagiarized from John Parkinson's book. Is it Paradisi, and so the
Yes.
wonderful big herbal that you and other some very other nice former students bought me, which is this monster
Yeah.
here, which is amazing. But
And
Culpeper,
that is possibly plagiarized from some German herbal, I'm told.
was it
But
really?
that's why I mean I've never gone down that rabbit hole, but I read a
That
sentence.
is fascinating. See, this is what writing was like in the age
Yeah.
before copyright laws, people, where people would just nick stuff, and it wasn't considered bad form then because there wasn't the internet. It was just kind of pretty standard. People would just, because remember, printing had been invented for not maybe a century or two,
Yeah.
and previous to that, manuscripts were, as the name implies, written by hand. Manuscript means Latin for writing by hand. They were just copied by hand. So most texts were just copies of other
Yeah.
texts. So I think there's a hangover from those days where if a knowledgeable or erudite or good, useful book was produced, another author would simply rip chunks out of the text and then add their own
Got.
addenda or commentary to it, much as in the previous manuscript tradition, people would just write stuff in the margin. So I think that's sort of what happened with a lot of the main body of Culpeper's Herbal is verbatim from
Oh yeah.
Parkinson, but then he adds astrological addenda. But there are one or two entries that are completely 100% Culpeper, like his entry on wormwood, which is brilliant. And then the indexes,
There's
and there's
lots
a
of, I
lot of the
mean,
appendices that are purely
one of the
him.
things I like about Culpeper is you can always tell when it's Culpeper because he's quite snarky, if that's the right sort of word. And
Yes.
so he writes in quite a sort of, he'll say, actually, people say this is wonderful, blah, blah, but actually it's a load of rubbish. I've tried it on loads of people
Yeah.
as well.
There's some. Can you remember any quotes? Because there's one that I always quote, which is like, nettles and herbs so well known they can be recognized even by feeling in the darkest night. You know, just like that. That's a brilliant one. And then there's another one. I can't remember this verbatim though. I need to learn this quote because it amuses me every time I read it. It's about he's talking about distilled waters, and it says water of distilled water of strawberries. Was it this is nothing so good as for fattening gentlemen's pockets or something like that. He talks about it's basically useless, but it costs a lot of money. Do you know what I mean? So yeah,
Yeah.
he's great. He's great. But yeah, so Lilly was well. Do you seeing as I've
I'll
ridden your
start Lily.
coattails on Culpeper? Do you want to start with Lilly and I'll do the same?
Okay, I mean, William Lilly was a contemporary almost of Culpeper. And
Mm,
again, a little historical artifact. When after the Civil War, before the Civil War, while the king was still in charge, the king's censors you weren't allowed to publish anything without the king's censors having a look at it and saying, yes, you can publish it or no.
mm,
And things like astrology and things that upset doctors were definitely no's. And basically, it was a bit of a publishing free-for-all after the end of the Civil War under the Commonwealth.
mm,
And so it was a golden age for a lot of this. And it was very lucky for us, 21st century people, because a lot of stuff that got written down then, because it was the start of proper mass printing as well, that would probably have been lost otherwise. And so William Lilly, so as Culpeper published, this is wonderful herbal. William Lilly sort of published a definitive book on astrology of the time, Renaissance astrology, which goes all the way back through the Middle Ages and further. And it's called Christian astrology to keep everybody happy. So he wasn't, worshipping the devil or whatever.
So he wasn't a terrible pagan or an idolater or a sorcerer or something.
Exactly. And it's divided into 3 parts. And the first part is entirely horary questions, I recall. And then the second part is birth charts, is it? Or is it?
Yeah. You're I think that book 1 is book 1 and 2 usually sort of packaged together.
That's right, yes.
Because they're the horary ones. So book 1 is sort of more the technical
yes.
of astrology, like what are houses, what are planets, what are
That's right, yes.
All the appurtenances and equipment you will require. And book 2 is the horary, which is how to ask and answer questions, and that's the one that's really famous. And then book 3 is the nativities, I think.
That's right. No, that's absolutely it. And it's a wonderful book. I mean, to me, reading the horary stuff, I hadn't really done a lot of horary before I came to herbal medicine, so I didn't think, this is how it's done. What I found really surprising is I've done quite a bit of birth chart astrology, but 20th, 21st century birth chart astrology, and the Renaissance stuff is done in a completely different way. It's much more, not that you will feel angry today because Mars is but it's much more definitive, much more this will happen, and much more subtle. I mean, very, very subtle analyses of all sorts of things that really just you can almost argue that well, certainly I think the 21st century astrology is making up the gap, but certainly for the 20th century astrology had gone backwards in its complexity compared to William Lilly.
Yeah, arguably. I know I do have a lot of sympathy with that view, but I don't want to rile any
I wouldn't dream of riling anyone, and I have no problem with psychological astrology, but I still love it.
Yes.
But and in fact, the two mix quite well because now you've got twice the fun.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, obviously, we're sort of a similar mind in that we both have an interest in that sort of traditional stuff because of its. I think. I mean, this is just a point of view that I have in general. Sometimes I think that there is I actually heard it put very well in a book that I read. People in contemporary culture, there is a chronic general ingratitude. And I do sometimes think that's the case, where we sort of there's this assumption, this slightly sneery assumption that all of our ancestors were idiots, and you can read it sometimes even on entries in Wikipedia about humoral medicine or about herbs or any of the crazy stuff we're interested in, particularly on this podcast that we're talking about, where it's sort of like, oh, well, this is all pseudoscientific nonsense. This is all stuff that they used to believe back in the Dark Ages when they thought the Earth was flat. And it's like, well, I mean, obviously it doesn't say quite that in the entry. And by the way, they didn't think the Earth was flat, but the tone is often encountered. And I sort of think, well, look, I mean, there's a baby bathwater situation here. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that is getting thrown out there that was remarkably sophisticated. And I actually think in some ways, well, I don't think it's a case of better or worse. I think in as culture progresses in one way, we might lose things in another way. And I think there's arguably certain things that we may have lost. So certainly in my view, the astrology we practice today is way less sophisticated than the astrology that was practiced 500 years ago.
Oh yeah.
And I can say that with great certainty, despite the amazing number of different techniques. And there are some brilliant astrologers in the world today. So I'm not disparaging anyone by saying that. It's just that I just think, they did it without freaking computers. They used astrolabes. Have you seen an astrolabe?
I know.
They're amazing devices, but they had to do all that freaking geometry and just incredible. And I suppose as humans, we've always been part of a hive mind in a sense. We all depend on each other, and particularly with sciences, and particularly with something which, like astrology, which is nowadays regarded as a pseudoscience, because the scientific evidence is either equivocal or against it for the most part. There is some in favor of it. I mean, that'll be a whole other discussion on another day, I imagine. But
Yes, I won't get started.
yeah, because there's so many rabbit holes we can go down with that one. But I think the interesting thing is that it's with so we've always had to depend on other people, like producing astronomical tables of houses and that kind of thing, or even with herbal medicine, even before it was it might have been an oral tradition where you had to learn the plants from your family member, your mother or your grandfather or whoever it was.
Well, I mean, well, certainly you'd learn to recognize all the plants in the wild, and you'd be able to say that's that.
Exactly. So we none of us are islands, are we? And it's never been that. But I nevertheless think that in particularly with astrology, you had to work a lot harder, and the techniques that they developed, despite not having the advantage of instant computation that we have now, is just incredible.
Well, and this is I think one of the big things in favor of astrology is real. Not that I need convincing. It's like these people to do this must have been incredibly clever, and it took a very long time. And if it didn't work, why on earth did they bother?
Yeah. Well, you see, a skeptic would say, Ollie, you're making an appeal both to history and authority with that, So,
I know,
but then this, I know exactly that's what I call, the fallacy often applies with this thing. You can stick the word fallacy on anything and call it a fallacy. But at the end of the day, I agree. I think that, this stuff was, obviously astronomy was only invented for astrological purposes. All of the ancient monuments that are particularly sort of temples and there's a whole discipline now, isn't there? Astroarchaeology or archaeoastronomy. Archaeoastronomy, I think they call it. Where they look at the ruins, and of course again you hear this on documentaries and Wikipedia and places like that, where they sort of they get mealy-mouthed about that. They sort of say, oh, they were amazing astronomers, and I want to shout at the telly or at the screen, astrologers, they were doing astrology, that's why they built them. Do you know what I mean? It's like they wanted to calculate the positions of things for divinatory purposes or for ritual purposes. That's why they were doing it. But I mean, that's a whole thing. That's a whole separate thing. But
God, yes. Another podcast, yes.
All right. Well, I think we've sort of probably I've certainly ranted myself to a standstill at this point. But I mean, is there any? I mean, I guess I would say if anyone has any comments or questions or anything that you'd like us to talk about, then please just whack them in the comments box.
Absolutely. I mean, we wanted to talk about decumbiture in a broad sense because it ties into a lot of the starting points of astrological and herbal medicine. Because, as Marcos said, you don't need to know your patient's date of birth or location or etc. So it's much less intrusive. It's a very powerful technique. And you can take as much of it from it as you want. I mean, you could simply just see what planet is on the ascendant. The ascendant.
Absolutely. And just I think probably it would be worth maybe in the next episode talking a little bit about the ethics of using astrology with it, because I
love ethics.
Yes, and there's a lot to be talked about there. Particularly given that astrology is something that isn't mainstream currently, and that doesn't have scientific backing in the main. It's something which, certainly I know a lot of my clients and patients are very interested in, but not everyone is.
Well, as they say, it's an odd thing, astrology versus astronomy, for instance. There's certainly more astrologers than astronomers in the world, but
yes, that's true.
People earning a living off it. And I don't know what that says about the contemporary culture, but
Yeah, that's a very good point, Ollie. Actually, yes. Anyway, right, we'll sign off here. I hope this has been of some interest to some of you, and hopefully we'll see you again in a couple of weeks. This will be going out every 2 weeks or so, folks.
Very much looking forward to it. See you
Brilliant.
then,
Right.
Marcus.
See you, Ollie.
Bye-bye.